Hey, what are you doing? As soon as I hit camera off, camera on, and it comes back on. I'm just going to let it record and stream. Let's see. Yeah, gives them something to play with.
I think it's running. My pulse, my resting heart rate was 49. That's pretty low.
Adam, you got spare time this afternoon?
Sure.
Go over to the nut factory across the street. They reported their fire alarm system's out of service to the city.
Their fire alarm?
So we need to go over there and find out what's out of service, what's not working, and if they need to have a fire watch or not. Okay. If it's the whole building or just a section or. Okay. I'm Pat.
Hi, Pat.
Just give us an update on what's going on.
Caleb.
Caleb. Yeah, very good.
With a K, the Icelandic
spelling.
Hey, Adam.
Adam, Pat, Flannery. Nice to meet you, Adam. I should remember your name.
Still Chris.
You're still Chris.
With a C.
With a C. Not a K. I got that. See, I got that.
He remembers from yesterday. It was not the Viking spelling.
What show did you watch?
That was Fashion Star.
It was that car show. Yes. Just going to start the recording. I was telling us about it.
Oh, Pat, I
Ever since then, all we've said is
TJ.
Well,
TJ.
Chris with a C, not the Viking spelling. What? You know what's the matter? I do, but I'll tell you that I can't. Right across that angle. And I don't see problem with all. Oh.
All right, I guess I'll get started. My goal is to get through the next hour and 10 minutes without any whistles and bells going on.
We tried.
Good luck. See how it works.
How was this morning?
They got pulled out. Something about a pot shop or something to that effect.
I have no idea what that was.
Good afternoon. My name is Pat Flannery. I work for a company called Clear Risk Solutions. I work as actually not an employee, but a contractor employee. And I do trainings around the state. We work for cities, counties, schools, and nonprofit. Okay, you would be part of the city's pool, City Insurance Association of Washington. There are over 100 in the state of Washington. The only reason I mention that, just so you know, if there's a big claim or a lawsuit, you pay so much and the pool kicks in, just like any other type of insurance. The training that we develop, design, and present, all of it has to do with minimizing risk. What are some things that create some challenges for employees and their entities? If they create a problem, sometimes it goes right to the entity itself, the company, the organization. And we don't have to make up or pretend or guess what training should be provided, because it comes to us all the time in the form of claims and lawsuits that pertain to different issues. Like, for example, with diffusing anger might end up with a claim of hostile work environment or that type of thing, or even sexual harassment. I'll talk later about a lot of times sexual harassment motivation is retaliation, and it's anger, not always something of a sexual nature. So my background is education, former teacher, coach. I was a middle school principal for a number of years. And when I retired, I had 3 daughters that were entering college. So the idea of fully retiring wasn't in the package, okay? So I started working as a consultant years ago. Liked it so much, I just have kept doing it and adding again to the training, the ability to get around and see different people, see their work, see some of their issues, and all of those things I find very interesting. So I've continued to do it. This, as I mentioned, the training lasts a little over an hour and 10 minutes, something like that. But please, with a small group, interrupt me with questions. This morning, we had a group of about 8, and then all of a sudden 6 had to leave. And with 3, it became a very good conversation. And a lot of that is just attributed to them asking questions or that type of thing. It always adds to the party, okay? And there's not any, well, I shouldn't say that. There are probably some inappropriate questions, but most of the time, yeah. I don't know why they're looking at you. All right, so let me get started.
So let me interrupt real quick.
Sure.
So we are recording this class so that the people that can't make it will be able to watch it. We tried Monday. We had not a very good video quality. We got that all fixed. So I'm going to let that run. I'm going to turn it off from my office remotely.
Thank you.
So you're really on your toes. This is going to be watched by.
That's right. I've got to be careful. I have to put
on the good hat. So, and I did the class on Monday.
I'll take that.
Yeah, I'll take care of it. So
thanks a
enjoy.
lot.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you.
Okay, so it is being recorded, so I guess that does add a little sieve to what we're talking about, or maybe it doesn't. Here's the configuration of ClearRes. This would be an educational training, okay? Predict and prevent. That's all it is. I do also work in pre-litigation consulting. That would be more of a one-on-one. That would be something's already happened and be more of an intervention. Here's our topic. And here's the disclaimer that basically says, I'm not a lawyer, okay? This is just educational. Some of the things I will be discussing, we'll talk about the problem as it's defined. What is the issue? How does it connect with liability? Why are we even talking about it? What is the role of the employer? What is their duty of care? We'll talk about that. And workplace climate. Cover different dimensions of anger and the role of self-awareness when it comes to our own emotions, including anger. Define it, and then look at different types. And then I'll talk about effective responses to anger. Vulnerable organizations. What do they look like? An organization that is likely to possibly have a problem not only with anger, but then if that exists, not dealing with it. And steps to minimize anger and violence in the workplace. Let's look at some liability issues surrounding anger. It definitely covers workplace climate, has a negative impact on that, can lead to harassment, also, unfortunately, can lead to violence. So the goal, obviously, is to address it early on, okay, if you have an issue. And I'll talk later about that as far as the manager's role in that, the supervisor, the chief, the lieutenant. Here it's covered duty of ordinary care and what determines liability. Look at that. How many people are familiar with those four things? Does it look at all familiar? What have you seen it? Yesterday? Yesterday before the bells went up the side. Yeah, I mentioned that and asked the question. 31 years in education, I had never seen it. I went to a law conference. They spent 2 days talking about this and concluded by saying, everybody should know this. This is the ABCs of civil liability. It's going to take you 5 minutes for me, or take me 5 minutes to cover it. And you will know after that 5 minutes why you do all the stuff you do. Firefighters, you guys do, and gals do tons of different things in training, okay, and standard operating procedures. All of it pertains to this. This is the why you have policies, procedures, rules. This is in violation of those. It creates an issue of liability. Okay. So let's start with duty of ordinary care. Two primary duties. One is any time you provide a service, which you do, okay, you provide that service. Parallel with that, providing that service, is the expectation that it's done correctly, that the people are properly trained, they know the procedures, they have the right equipment. All of those things come into play whenever you provide a service. Now, I give this presentation to schools, cities, counties, nonprofit, and it's exactly the same thing. They all provide a service. You look at a city and all the different departments within that city, and each one has its own unique service that they provide and along with that comes the duty of care that it's done right. That's the one. There is a second duty of care, and that involves all of you. The employer, whatever title he or she has, they have the right and the responsibility to establish and maintain a safe, civil work environment for all of its, not just employees, but volunteers. Okay, when I make that statement, they have the right, right is the authority, responsibility is they have to do it to fulfill their duty of care, to establish and maintain a safe, more importantly, civil. The second I say civil, I'm hoping you're thinking of, yeah, that's why we're in this diffusing anger, because it fits into their responsibility to establish that. When you have sexual harassment training, same thing. Managing conflict, addressing personnel problems. These are all titles of trainings. And when I step back and look at the 15 or 16 trainings that I do, every one of them complies with, fulfills a duty of care. Whether it's to the service that's being provided or the employer's responsibility to allow you to work in a workplace that's safe and civil. Okay? That's that. A breach is an act or omission. You did something you shouldn't have done. That's an act. Omission, you didn't do something that you should have done. Think of your job right now, all the different things that you do. Hypothetically, just think of some type of thing that would be an act of something that you shouldn't do that pertains to your job. Can you think of one? So that's what I want you to do, is take this and directly apply it to what you actually do in your job. What are you thinking of? Which one?
Oh, I was just thinking of something I shouldn't do at work.
Okay, which would be?
Stealing a patient's wallet.
All right, stealing. You know, obvious. Some of them are very obvious. There are many things. Some pertain to the actual essential functions of your job. Not stealing might not be in your job description. It's just an expectation. But that would be an example. You're out doing a job, okay? Fighting fire someplace, doing something in the line of work. Can you think of an example there that would be an action that you shouldn't do? Anything that you don't follow procedures, right? You didn't follow protocol or the process of what you do. An omission would be you didn't do something but you should have done. Maybe caution. Cautioning someone not to go in a building or that type of thing. You didn't say anything, didn't make any attempt. That would be a breach, okay? As a result of your breach, there were damages. Okay? We're human beings, we make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes do not result in damages to the individual or property. That's called a teachable moment. Okay, we learn, hopefully, sit back and say, oh, I shouldn't have done it that way. But nobody was hurt, luckily. Teachable moment. All right, the last one is proximate cause. And when we defend you, typically we're defending you through proximate cause. And proximate cause just means we've established you had a duty. And there was a breach of duty. And you did something you shouldn't have done, or the opposite. You didn't do something you should have done. And as a result, and I mean direct result, of your action or inaction, there were damages. Proximate cause just establishes the line of cause and effect throughout. Any questions on that? This one, civil liability, it is applied in the United States in courtrooms every single day. The same process is used. Whether the damages are a broken arm or a wrongful death lawsuit, okay, we've dealt with both. We look at where they start. They go through that trial, duty of care, and then proving the breach, and then proving the damages in proximate cause. As we defend with proximate cause, here's some examples of court cases. Actual examples, a school setting. Playground supervisor tells a kid for a timeout for discipline to go stand in a timeout area. Standard practice. That's important too, by the way. We don't want to be the only one that does that. The kid is upset and he runs home. It happened. Kid got hit by a car. It happened. He was injured. Not seriously, but bad enough where the parents sued the district. We defended the district with proximate cause. Playground teacher didn't tell that kid to run home. He did it on his own initiative. Same thing would be, you're trained and provided all this stuff. You go out of the standard operating procedures and do something that is totally different, and you're injured as a result of it. Well, as you know, most of the standard operating procedures, everything revolves around one thing: safety. Okay? And that would be another example. But in that case, we did win, even though the lawyers are spending a lot of time talking about, you should have known that kid was a runner. You know they're going to go there, right? You should have known. So any questions on this? 5 minutes, now you're all lawyers, okay? It's funny, when I present this, I always ask, has anybody seen this? Because if a hand goes up, a lot of times they're a lawyer, and they spend the first 2 years in law school going through these 4 steps. But again, we have it in a lot of our trainings because it sort of is the foundation for establishing why we do what we do. Okay? We have that duty of care. Workplace climate. They're the employer. The boss has the right and responsibility. I've mentioned that. Safe, you could add the word civil behind that, the safe and civil workplace. And the employee has a duty of care for safety as well. Also, you have state and federal laws that demand that you deal with protected classes properly. You have your policy manuals and handbook regarding harassment. Basically, it's covering all forms of harassment.
I really tried today.
Thank you, sir.
Where you guys going to?
Now, how do you know that they go and you guys stay?
The tone. They have
Isn't that a unique tone for each group? That's cool.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you.
I'll be here if you get back
We'll see you in
within
a
an
few
hour or
minutes.
so.
Maple Street,
Yep, we'll see you in a few minutes.
Do you think they'll call you too?
not for this one.
No.
I don't know. I'm being taped here, so I can just see everybody leaving, and I'm saying, "Oh, I've got to finish this."
Just share for the camera.
And I'll pretend. Maybe I'll get some dummies up here.
Just talk to them.
We've got some of that.
There's some actual dummies in there. Maybe that would be kind of add a little humor to it. Let's look at the escalation of anger. And I should start from the bottom. If I were a tech person, I'd be able to, but it starts with somebody's just upset, disgruntlement. And then it progresses and gets worse. Obviously, the escalation, we want to deal with it at its lowest level. We want to avoid violence. And look at the violence against property. That would be a bomb threat. See, because there's a call. And what is the purpose of a call? Get people out of the building, right? If it were violence against people, you wouldn't have a call. I attended a conference in Seattle that was put on by a Boston bomb expert before the Boston bombing. It was before that. That's all this person did is deal with bombs. And obviously, bomb threats, a big part of his job. And the room was filled with school people, mainly superintendents. And when he said that we do not evacuate on most bomb threats, you could hear the groans throughout the crowd from the superintendents, because that would be the end of their job if they didn't do it. And he said, no, don't. He said, I understand. You're going to vacate the building. How long do you vacate the building? 15, 20 minutes, and the janitor and a couple teachers walk through the halls? He said, that's typically what you're saying. He said, and he's played a tape of 2 different threats, one that was real, one that was a hoax. He said, you know, we take a big risk in calling something a hoax, and if it's real, obviously, there's going to be a lot of problems. But he said, we dealt with lawsuits in the evacuation of kids. And gave an example of one bus that had kids fighting in the back of the bus. This is in the evacuation process. Bus driver couldn't break it up. Security guard went back there, and pepper sprayed the 2 kids plus a bunch of other kids that happened to be back there. A lawsuit resulted from that. So they said, you know, we're operating within our culture. He said, by the way, when we shut a school down, it's usually for a week because we go through the whole thing. We have the dogs and the robots, not the principal and the janitor. So it's just a different thing, okay? It's a different culture. We're going to continue to do what we do and what we know best, even though it's one heck of a nuisance to have to evacuate kids. So that's the escalation there, and the whole point there is obviously we want to deal with it at its lowest level. Switching to physiological factors involved with the human body when they become angry. And all of these happen almost simultaneously, within a second. And I say within a second because it's less than a second. It is immediate. The cognitive, think of this. When you see a person that you know, you tell stories in a fraction of a second about what you remember, the context of that relationship with that person, right? If it's a positive one, positive thoughts exist. The story is positive. If it's a real negative one, just the opposite. In the case of anger, there are sometimes people, all you have to do is see them and you become angry because of a real bad experience or experiences with that individual in the past. Just human nature. It's how we're built. That cognitive means the sight of something triggers stories, and the stories are derived from the context of what you know about that person. Okay? There's that one. Right along with that, these things called, on top of your kidneys, that are called the pituitary glands, the adrenaline, that kicks in. You don't have any control over that. And there's another thing that happens that makes dealing with anger even more difficult. The blood in your brain leaves to go to large muscles, legs and arms. Right? Anybody know why that happens? What is that a part of?
Fighting.
Fight, exactly. Fighting or flight. You're right. It's either you're going to fight. See, think in terms of our evolution and animals. With all animals, that happens. Okay, the same thing. Homo sapiens were not left out of that triggering motion of the blood leaving the brain. The only difference is, if we know that, if we're aware of that, which animals aren't, okay, we're better able to handle that and deal with that, knowing that we're somewhat disabled. So, and I think most of us that are able to handle our emotions, how do you feel when you're getting angry? What do? Sometimes you try to slow down. You try to breathe deeply. Sometimes you count to 10. I remember hearing that years ago, and I thought it was pretty stupid. I don't think it's stupid anymore. Because what I'll be talking about is buying a little bit of time between the stimulus, what happens to you, and how you respond. The fact is, the immediate response is never the best one. Sometimes it's the very worst one. In other words, someone yells, you immediately yell back, you get into the thing, it escalates immediately. So you're trying to buy a second or two, and I'll talk a lot about that when I talk about stimulus and response. So you have the emotional, you have all the things that are happening chemistry-wise in your body that makes it even more difficult to make that wise decision at that crucial time. And you think about it, some of those crucial conversations, if you want to call them, some of those important decisions are expected to be made during the time when you're at your worst. I'll talk about conflict and stress later, and how when we grow professionally, it's our style under stress that we're trying to improve. That reveals our professionalism, which is unveiled, professionalism, unveiled, revealed during tough times. Not when everything is going great. Anybody can be professional then. The true professional is demonstrated during the difficult times. To the extent, to the truism of that, there's an old African proverb that says, smooth seas don't make skillful sailors. You know what that's saying? It means it's during the storms that we learn our skills. I add to that, I say, the storm just gives you the opportunity, the conflict, the argument, the anger, the emotion, all of those things. All they're doing is giving you an opportunity to learn and grow and become more professional. Doesn't mean you're automatically going to do it. Just like those guys on that boat during the storm, if they work with it, they might get better. But that's I looked at that proverb and said, yeah, that fits exactly with the message here. So the next one is communication. Communication. How do you show, or think about this, how can you tell when someone is angry? I mean, there aren't any words. Let's talk about nonverbal. You know, nothing is being said, but just by looking at someone, that person's mad. And how do you know that? Any thoughts?
Or body language.
Yeah, body language, which is over half of communication. 67% is body language of our communication. The different things that can be, you know, the arms here, the face red, the hands here, the glare, the twitch. Speaking of twitches, here's a communication. In my past, as in education, I was doing negotiations with the superintendent. He and I were negotiating with the union, who happened to be a woman. I refer to her as the high priestess. Have you ever heard that term, high priestess? It's someone that may not have the title, but they have a lot of influence. That described her. She had a lot of influence. Very bright woman, and good to work with because she was reasonable. But this was a tough negotiation. We got to a tough deal, a sticking point, if you call it anything. And the reason I mention it is because the superintendent, who was a very good superintendent, but he had some flaws like we all do. Well, when he got mad, he had a little blood vessel that you could see popping here. And I'm looking here, I'm sitting next to him, I look over and I see that thing, and I knew there was going to be a show. And sure enough, but see, I mention it because that prepared me. That second or two just kind of, all right, hold on to the saddle. There's going to be a rough ride coming up. And sure enough, pointing the fingers, raising his voice. But the high priestess, instead of interrupting, and I mentioned this story because it covers not just the communication, but how you should try to respond during an attack of anger. She did a perfect job. She didn't interrupt. The look she had was a look like she was just holding on to every word he said. The one thing she was not intimidated. Okay, she didn't cower. She stood her ground, was assertive. Okay, always say, be assertive, but don't be aggressive. He was being aggressive. She just asserted herself in a posture of not combative, but just listening. Very effective. And she waited. He continued. And of course, have you ever been where someone's trying to argue with you and they want you to argue back and they're mad because you won't? Sure. That was happening here. And she continued on, and finally he just ran out of gas. She still waited until she was sure he was done, and then very politely asked, "Are you done?" And his head kind of went down and he said, "Yeah, I'm done." And I think it was in that moment that he learned that that's probably something he needs to put in the round can is a procedure. Because he was a big guy. He had a lot of strengths, positive strength. But that wasn't one of them. But I think she taught him something that afternoon. So that's the communication. Then the effect is, how does it affect your entire environment? I'll talk later about there's certain things that happen. One of them is rigidity. You ever try to talk to someone that's angry and they don't listen, they can't hear a thing, they're just focused on what they're angry about, and they're just zeroing in on that, and rigidity is a word that can describe that. Nothing gets in. No information. They've made up their mind. They're mad. That can be the effect. And then the one that probably counts the most, all this stuff happens. What do you do about it? And the what do you do about it becomes the most important thing. That determines whether you're going to work and you're going to continue to go to work or you're going to go to jail. Okay? Kind of an important decision behavior. So let's look at the scenario where that happened. Somebody's driving down the road. A car cuts in front, almost runs you off the road. All of these things kick into gear with the driver. And they might even say a few words out loud to the person that did that or whatever. But soon after, and I say within 30 seconds to a minute, things dissipate back to normal. You turn the radio up, and they haven't totally forgotten it, but they put it out of their mind, and it's not eating at them. You know what I'm saying when I say that? It's grinding away. Is that can happen when we magnify things. I'll talk about that later. The second driver, the exact same thing happens. Cuts in front. All this stuff kicks into gear. Reaches in his glove box, gets his gun, goes after the person. Does that happen? Yeah. Road rage, we hear about that and know that exists. So an example of two different things where the behavior is key. All this stuff happens, and later I'll talk about stimulus response, where we can't control sometimes the stimulus, but we always have control in a decision that you said, a choice on what response are we going to take. You can read that. I'm too angry now, I'll be back in 3 hours. And as I look at that, I'd say, sometimes I remember in my career, there were times when I had to say, let's stop this conversation and come back tomorrow with it. Both of us are too emotionally ingrained in this. I don't think we're going to accomplish anything. So taking the time out sometimes is a good thing. However, research shows that a lot of times people don't take the time out. They don't even go to what is an important conversation that they really need to have. They avoid it. That's where you get the term silence or violence. Okay? Fight or flight, the terms used where you're not in dialogue, you're going the opposite direction. That is not a good thing. But there are certain times during the heat of a deal where the best thing is just take a time out. Because safety becomes the number one thing. What about stress? It's not the same as anger, it's similar. And I like the definition. Stress is a result from an imbalance between situational demands and resources to respond to those demands. Very simple definition. That defines what stress is. And the fact that stress can evoke anger, but it doesn't always. Sometimes people get depressed or something. And then a real important factor in all of this, the ability to handle your own anger. A very important factor is your self-awareness. Okay? And because people that get angry a lot, their self-esteem and their self-awareness are pretty low. They're not internal thinkers. It just like lightning hit them. They may feel bad afterwards and kind of, oh geez, I really messed up or that type of thing. That may happen, or they may justify what they did. I had the right to get that angry. Okay? But unfortunately, in the anger that I'm talking about, they repeat the pattern. This is not about occasional anger that we all have. This is about someone that actually uses anger to manipulate and get what he or she wants. And that happens in the workplace. So you look at that, the fact that self-esteem is critical to the effective functioning, and it does bring clarity. Okay. Self-awareness becomes very important in so many things. Let me just explain one process, a cycle of professional growth that I usually present at this time because I think it's very important. Here's people that grow and get better through experiential knowledge, become more professional as time goes on, as they experience different things and different challenges. They learn from each one of those challenges. Just a couple of things. We typically are given the opportunity to grow, and I sort of mentioned it when I talked about the smooth seas and the storm. Typically, the opportunity to grow happens during tough times, because it's then when we are challenged professionally. Remember I said that's when your professionalism is unveiled. What is your, how do you operate under stress? What is your style under stress? What do you like? And when I say stress, it could be anger, conflict, a serious conversation, argument, all of those things. It asks you to, hey, step up. What is your level of professionalism in how you handle that tough conversation? Now, here's the process. That happens, and it happens to all of us, right? Hopefully not all the time, but it's going to happen. And we need to deal with it, and then we need to put it behind us because another one's going to come down the pipe. All right, something happened. The self-awareness, self-reflection thing is this. You ask yourself, what happened? And try to define it. And boy, the important thing through all of this is honesty. An honest assessment. This is what happened. This is how I responded. Again, honesty overlays whether or not it's worth a darn or not. Are you being honest about it? And I say honest, but don't be too tough on yourself. Sometimes the very top of people are self-critical, too much so. So this is what happened. This is how I responded. And the third question is, this is what I could have done that would have resulted in a better outcome. Okay? This is what happened. This is how I responded. This is what I could have done as I look back at it. Now think what's happening in just that simple little process that you probably all do. You learn. You get better. You take I refer to it as the takeaway. You steal the opportunity. There's somebody wanting to get in. The opportunity to learn something. And back to what I said originally, it's during those tough times that our opportunities to learn become the most important. I remember, for example, I'll self-report here. I was out on the San Juans shrimping. Tough job. And my phone rings, and it's a lawyer that works for Clear Risk. She said, "Where are you?" "Hi, how are you?"
Sorry to wait.
"You're fine." "Elliot, is it?"
Yep.
"Pat Flannery. Nice to meet you." "Where are you?" I said, "I'm out in the San Juans fishing." "You're supposed to be in Vancouver, Washington at a training, at a workshop. We have 200 bus drivers waiting for it." Could you imagine how I felt in that second? And that's an example of bad stuff happens. And, you know, my whole thing, because I didn't have any record of it, my whole thing was, I'm going to fix it. And I even would tell people, it's my mistake, but I'm going to fix it. Whatever, I don't even know. It was no place on my computer. In the archives, in the trash. How you doing?
Good.
John, I'm Pat.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Step on the box there.
Yeah.
So anyhow, that's an example of big mistake, my error, my job is a takeaway. It's not going to ever happen. And I can tell you the things, the cross-checks that we do now to make sure that there's no miscommunication. But you'll experience something, and I know you already have, where a big mistake is made, you messed up, and hey, that happens. We're human beings. But if you don't do anything to fix it, that's your bad, right? If I didn't go back and say, hey, we're going to double check, we're going to do this and this, I want to make darn sure we never have that happening. And it hasn't. Knock on wood. I'm here, right? So, all right. What provokes you? What makes you mad? Do you know? See, that's part of self-awareness too, isn't it? You're aware. And why would that, knowing what makes you mad, well, it's a sense of preparedness. That all of a sudden the phone rings at 6 o'clock, you know, 80% chance it's a telemarketer. They call when they know you're home at dinner or whatever. And it used to be a lot worse with regular phones instead of cell phones, but it still happens occasionally. And knowing that, and then rather than, I remember I would have some comments to those people that worked in those cubicles overseas someplace, making minimum wage, just doing their job, and finally provoking, and someone said, why do you act that way to them? It's not their deal. And I said, yeah, you're right. Changing that. But what provokes you, and then also, what provokes other people near to you? I think that helps, of course. Whether you want to back off a little bit or that type of thing, or again, just an awareness of what's happening emotionally with them as they become more and more angry. The low self-awareness, you see people that just blunder into it, and it's just like they were hit by lightning. All of a sudden, they're just screaming mad. Where did that come from? What happened? Sometimes it can be just a little thing, or sometimes it is a definite issue with those individuals. I was asked the other day about drunk anger, or I guess it could be any intoxication anger. And that's a little different thing because it's accentuated, okay? And it can happen, and they can be more belligerent, and they can be more rigid and less. So handling those people, like one lieutenant said, I think we should have done what we ended up doing sooner rather than listen to all the barrage of garbage. And they're probably right. So what provokes you? And understanding that the anger emotion is contagious. It can be caught. We know that when we go into a room and everybody's negative, it's hard to remain positive with that sea of negativity, right? So knowing that, hey, I don't want to catch this, preparing yourself, insulating yourself, or maybe even being around a person that's always negative. I don't want to go there with that person. I don't want to turn into a negative person myself. So knowing that you can catch it, whether it's negativity or any emotion, the opposite is true. You're at a ball game and an exciting win and that type of thing, the crowd's going crazy. It's contagion. Emotion, contagion. Funeral, same emotion thing. So just being aware that it is a catchy type of thing can help you prepare to deal with it. Okay, I'm not going to go there. I remember many times as a principal seeing with certain groups of teachers preparing for whatever it was going to be, and sometimes it wasn't positive stuff. There is appropriate anger, anger that actually helps us. Crucial. It can be a survival thing. Somebody picks up a car to get a person out, which happened a few days ago up north. It can be a response to trauma. And, I believe it's not just strictly anger at all. As a matter of fact, anger might be a secondary emotion. I think you have fear, anxiety, all kinds of emotions happening in a point of crisis. But we're talking about problem anger. By that I mean people are actually using their anger to get what they want from other people. It's all about control. What happens when you allow anger to control? You become locked into a belief system, and it can cause many things. I've mentioned rigidity. You're shut down. No more information's coming in here. This person's red hot mad. They've shut off any communication. Become rigid. And they magnify. They take the little thing and they make it a huge thing as they fester on it. Okay? Think about it. Somebody says something to somebody in the morning and it's just kind of not that big a deal, but it becomes over the day a bigger and bigger deal. Or destructive labeling, the stereotype. It's part of anger as far as I just want to put these people all in one box and label them this type because it's easier that way, see. And I'm angry and I want to be able to do that. All blank do this or believe this or whatever. And then you have the imperative thinker. They're the ones that think, because I think this way, because I do these things, You're supposed to do it too. I call people back right away when they call me. You're supposed to do it too. It doesn't always work that way. The imperative thinker. And then you have the mind reader, and they start out their conversation with you by saying, I don't know if this ever happens to any of you. I know what you think. You ever have people say that to you? And they don't have a clue what you're thinking? But they're going to tell you, I know what you think. Some people do that a lot, and even correcting people say, you know, that's not a very good way to start a conversation, because it's assuming something that basically is not factual. Okay? For the statement, you can have your own opinion, but you can't have your own facts. All right, we're going to look at two different things that can create the reason why some people, as adults, are angry people. Two ways that they got there and continue to be that. And it doesn't have to be just adults. It can be kids growing up. They learn this very, very early, especially the operant learning. I'll talk about that. Let's look at modeling first. You grow up with people yelling and shouting in your household, you just think that's the way you communicate. That's the way things get done. Okay? And it's not that it results in fistfights and all that stuff, but it's just a shouting, arguing, very tumultuous type of thing. I was presenting, and this woman raised her hand. She said, I'm going to say some things that are kind of a stereotype. I'm Italian, and I grew up in a family that yelled and screamed all the time. That's how we addressed issues. She said, then I got married. My husband did something stupid, so and the audience said, you yelled and screamed at it. She said, yeah, I yelled and screamed and yelled and screamed. I was mad. Then I got even more angry. You know why? Because he just stood there. He said, you're not fighting fair. You're supposed to yell and scream back like it's growing up. That's how we do things. He didn't enter into the fray. He stood there, and when she ran out of steam, he politely and sincerely apologized. I didn't know that that affected you that way. She said, you know, I got even more angry at first because he was able to just stay, and I'm so used to just being back and forth, yell and scream. That's how we did things. But then I suddenly realized that my husband had taught me something. As a result of the stimulus of yelling and screaming, there's another response besides yelling and screaming back, and that's to do exactly what he did. And obviously, he said, our marriage has been much smoother since then as far as our ability to communicate effectively. So that's the modeling and the story that really explains what I'm talking about. The operant learning is you do it because it worked. Okay? You yell and scream to get the TV remote. It works. Okay, it worked. I got it. Kid in the candy aisle yells and screams to get the candy. It worked. You think they're going to remember that candy aisle the next time they're in there? Of course they will. Matter of fact, I tell my dog story. I had a big yellow lab that occasionally would ride in the back of my pickup. And I say occasionally because I didn't take my pickup that often, and I certainly didn't have my lab in back that often as well. But it was in back, and I pulled into a bank to the drive-through, and the dog's just back there and panting, big, just happy as can be. You know how that works. And I do my banking, and the lady hands the dog, my dog, a dog biscuit. Tom was just smiling even more and really, really, really happy, and didn't think anything of it, took off. And 2 years later, as I said, I'm not driving that pickup very often, and I don't have that dog in back, but I did this day. And I just pulled off the road into the bank, and my dog, I looked, what is going on? My dog was just going crazy with excitement, running back and forth, running back. It remembered the dog biscuit. Operant learning. Okay, we do things because it works. When you look at that, a belief system that gives you permission to intimidate and control others or situations. The modeling and operant learning lead to that. Anybody heard of the man Viktor Frankl? He was a professor in Vienna. He was also Jewish. He was in prison in Nazi Germany. Okay, I believe it was Poland where the camp was. And horrible, horrible treatment. And many of his friends and family died as a result of the Holocaust. He survived, and he studied, and one of his reasons for survival, and he writes this in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, was him concentrating deeply on what he could learn from this tragedy. There is even in that takeaway that I talked about. And he wanted to find out what was the takeaway. And it started with this realization. All of the people received horrible, horrible treatment. The same. Not one over the other or anything. And they all got to the same level at very fast, which was deplorable. Okay? But he noticed half the prisoners acted like saints. The other half acted like animals. And they all had the same treatment. And he wanted to find out why, what's happened here. And he would be tortured, and they would experiment on him, and he would survive all those by his thinking as far as that he has the choice of how he's going to respond. And he came through that writing something that is used today in all kinds of research as far as man's ability to decide how he's going to respond. And he came up with it. He referred to it that you have a stimulus. That was the horrible conditions at the death camp. But then there's a space, and with that space, the ability to decide your response. He referred to that space as the last of human freedoms. Now, you can call it a lot of different things. Earlier today, someone said, before I mentioned that, you have a choice to respond. You have that choice. And he's referring to that choice is the last of human freedoms. I think it's, when you think about it, it really says a lot. Because we can't control, it has everything to do with like attitude, the ability to how we're going to respond to things. It's all about that. It's a huge part of our lives. The last of human freedoms. The freedom to choose your response. Proactive is responsible choice. And the term responsible, you are able to respond. I'm not talking about, this whole thing isn't referring to occasional outbursts of anger. We've all been there, done that, right? We all said and done things we probably shouldn't have said or done. Yeah. I'm talking about someone that typically uses anger a lot. And it can be used to take the form of direct threats, intimidation, assault, sarcasm, or even rumors. Sometimes that anger can spurt out with those types of things. There's even the study on sexual harassment where they talk about anger. A lot of times it's a retaliation type of thing. They're mad. It's not things of a sexual nature in all cases. It can be something of retaliation, and they're mad at the person. Even the, going back, anybody old enough to remember the tailhook scandal of the Navy back in the early 90s? Let me just explain it. Tailhook is the guy, the gunner that rides in the back of these bombers, at the back of the plane. Refer to tailhook people. They had a conference in Las Vegas. The Navy's made up of 98% men and 2% women. And at that conference, the men start groping females in the elevator, groping them, making gauntlets to their rooms and reaching out and grabbing them and groping them. Horrible thing that got all kinds of news. How they got news out in the early 90s. It was there. A lot of ink, okay? The Navy felt horrible. They felt ashamed. But you know what they did? They said, okay, this happened to us, to our people, men and women, although primarily men, and that's a factor, by the way, that comes into play, that has to do with firefighters as well, behaved in a horrible way. We can't believe they would do that with all the training and discipline, that they would revert and resort to those kinds of behaviors. And they did a lot of firing, a lot of demoting, all kinds of stuff. But then they asked, we're going to find out how that happened. So they did all kinds of studies on what changes a work environment that would cultivate the possibility of any kind of sexual harassment. Part of my sexual harassment training, I have 2 or 3 slides that I introduce by saying, the next 3 slides are brought to you by the U.S. Navy, and they are. And it's good, very valuable information. And I mention all of this because part of it was when they looked at different factors, and one of them was rarity. When you have a majority of one gender, it can be more females than men. It doesn't matter. When you have that, you need to be careful that you're not thinking of majority rule, or hey, you need to lighten up because we're just like that. This is who we are, that type of thing. That was part of it. Another part was the leader, he or she, and what they model and what they confront has a tremendous amount of that. But right at the end was anger. And I never had a real good idea of how did anger fit into the whole thing with sexual harassment, or why those people would grope and do those things. And so I did more research, and I found out that the anger was because tailhookers were, in the past, all men. And women were starting to enter into that career. And some men became very angry. And I just said some men were upset at the fact that their all-men career thing was now being implemented by some women. They used that as, they figured that, and they wanted to be brutally honest with all of that. So, by the way, with firefighters, remember it used to be firemen? Anybody remember? I was going to look that up on my break, and I didn't do that. You can look it up. When did firemen change to firefighters because of the influx of females? I think it was in the early 90s. Not just a side note, but I'm going to look it up before tomorrow. I mentioned something like that, and I don't know, because I think it's kind of interesting. Because firefighters are going through the same type of challenge. And when I do sexual harassment, if there's rarity that exists within that organization, I spend time talking that, hey, just keep in mind, you just need to be smart about that. Do you receive any training with that?
Sexual harassment?
Yeah, that. I'm sure you've had sexual. Did they ever talk about rarity? Do you remember that term? It doesn't ring a bell?
No.
Okay. Have me do your next sexual harassment training. All right, let's go on here. Anger, sometimes, not all the time, can be produced by fear. You're fearful that something's not going to turn out right. Look at the focus. Sometimes that's referred to as locus, Greek meaning location of control, is external with these people. In other words, it's hard for them to internalize and accept their responsibility for what they're doing. It's always, they're kind of the yeah, but people. Yeah, but this person did this. Yeah, but this person made me mad. Yeah, but this person. Our prisons are filled with yeah, but people. Which a lot of them, it's external. They can point to several factors that contributed to their wrongdoing, but sometimes have a hard time owning up to their own involvement. You can read that definition. It's rather lengthy. The very last part of it talks about reaction to a perceived threat, which basically means it may not be an actual threat, but if you perceive it, that's what counts. Then I'll talk about different types of anger: righteous, smokescreen, manipulative, displaced, and built up. Let's look at each one. Righteous is probably the most common. You have the right to be mad. We've all had that happen to us. But keep in mind, if I'm talking about a person with a problem in anger, I'm talking about someone that finds just about everything to get mad at. Righteously, all these different things. You've heard of the term, when I'm around that person, it's like walking on eggshells. That's this. Because they are able to find. So we're not talking about occasion where we've all been wronged and get ticked off. That's human nature. We're talking about someone that constantly is always getting angry over the littlest things. Smokescreen. They're not really angry at what's that. It's a smokescreen. They want to pretend they're angry so the attention isn't directed at what they're trying to hide. That can happen a lot. Someone puts on a show of anger. They just don't want you to go where there's a problem. Manipulation, very common. Manipulate people to get what you want through anger. Like the child's anger and a temper tantrum. You think of a young child, they don't have a whole bunch of power, but what power they have, they use it to the max sometimes. And that's that tantrum. That's what you're seeing. That kid only has the ability to communicate a certain amount, but boy, they can get attention when they do that tantrum thing. And then displace anger. You're not able to exhibit your anger at one person maybe, so you hold on to it and it comes out in another person. You're not able to display anger at work, so it comes out at home, that type of thing. This one is a dangerous one, built up anger. Referred by counselor and psychologists as people that stuff it. Rather than express anger or work out or do something healthy to dissipate that anger, they just stuff it in. And then oftentimes down the road, it's a little thing that somebody just blow up. We see on the news somebody has killed their neighbors, and the other neighbors say, huh? This person is quiet and reserved, passive. I can't believe they stuffed it. And then all of a sudden they blow up. But today I'm already good at anger, and I know too much about management. It's management that makes me angry. Sometimes that can be the case. All right, let's look at effective responses. How do you respond to other people's anger directed at you? The very first thing in bold is safety. That's number one. In other words, all this other stuff goes out the window if your safety is in jeopardy. Give you an example. I was presenting for a county, and two women that deal with the county property taxes had a guy come in and was upset about his taxes that went up, I guess, and he started yelling and ranting, and they tried to deal with him, and they tried to deal with him, and it just got worse. Finally, he said, I've got a gun in my car, and I've got a bullet for you and a bullet for you, and left. Safety kicked into gear. I mean, all this other stuff goes out the window. They went to a locked room, called 911, took care of the situation. But she said, yeah, I know about safety being number one. Here's an example. It's a great story. The second one seems passive, but it really is not listening. Listening is the most powerful, effective response sometimes we can do, is just to listen to a person. Have you ever experienced listening to a person, and they tell at the end, thanks for listening? You didn't accomplish anything, but you just gave them your ear and attentively listened to them, heard them out, heard their side of the deal or their complaint or their concern. Yeah, so listening can be a very powerful way to diffuse anger. It doesn't always work. None of these always work. But listening is probably the number one tool that we use in dealing, effective tool, in effectively dealing with anger, is by attentively listening. We ask for clarification. We take it seriously, but not personally. We let them vent. All of these things occurred when I talked about the high priestess and what she did with that superintendent in that negotiations. She did all of these things very well. Modeled them perfectly. Empathy. Obviously, you're not going to match their tone or their anger. You're interested in problem solving, but don't pretend to have all the answers. And only apologize if you should. It can be counterproductive to apologize when apology is not necessary or isn't warranted. Sincere apology, though, however, in a timely way, when it's done, when you have made a mistake and you acknowledge that mistake, that has huge power. That dissipates a lot. Hey, I'm sorry. Just like that Italian woman, when the husband gave a sincere apology, she didn't know what to do. Sometimes, an honest, if you've made the mistake, if you've wronged someone, to step back and say, you're right. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have done whatever. I apologize. I went to a bank teller once to correct something, and she said, we don't make any mistakes. I said, that's the wrong thing to say. You really, and I was very nice about it, but any teller should be told, don't make that statement. try to get over it. See, the last one there said, get over it. You don't want to be the stuffer. And guess what? Something else is coming down the road at you. Another problem that you're going to have to deal with. So you do the best you can with the issue at hand, deal with it, close shop, move on. What about the employee that's showing anger all the time and has a negative influence on other people with their anger? Well, the employer, as I said earlier, they have the right, but they also have the responsibility to establish and maintain a safe, civil work environment. We deal with claims of hostile work environment all the time, and a lot of times when we peel it back, the boss, the supervisor, the manager, principal, whatever, chief, lieutenant, they knew about this, and they didn't do enough to address it. It comes down to the legal terms we've all heard over and over again. What did you know? When did you know it? What did you do about it? Becomes the test of, are you in the right spot? Did you do the right thing? Did you do due diligence? So there you have, you need to take the steps in progressive discipline. Has to be addressed. I mentioned earlier to a group that typically when I talk to managers, and I ask managers, hey, you have a crew of how many? And they'd tell me, we'd go around, they'd say, yeah, I've got 10, I've got 3, I've got 6, I've got 20. Of all those people, what percent are hardworking professional people that all you need to do is tell them what to do and get out of their way and facilitate occasionally? And you know the response across the state is consistently in the 90s. Not in the 80s, it's way up there. Typically, they just have maybe 1 or 2 problem people that they need to have conversations with occasionally. And I said, what do you hate the most about your job? Managers. What do you think they answered? Having that conversation with that person. That's the number one thing they don't like, but it defines who they are as a manager. The essential function of being able to do that effectively elevates them beyond the employee. That's what you're put in that position to do. And I said, you know what you do when you do that? You honor that 90% of the people that are hardworking professionals. You're honoring them. Because when you don't do it, it's upsetting. When they see someone getting away with stuff that is unprofessional or wrong or violates policy or rules or whatever, and nothing is done about it, that is a form of disgruntlement. So that becomes an important thing. Now I talk about workplace violence just a little bit. Workplace homicide is the fastest growing category for murder in the United States. That's scary. All of a sudden. And here's the second slide on it. And look at the second point. You got the cost, which is very high. And by the way, this is 2005, so it needs to be and will be updated. I'm afraid when I update it, it's going to be even worse. But look at number 2. Homicide is the leading cause of death in the workplace for women. Second for men. What's number 1 for men? I get asked that all the time. Accidents. For men, it's accidents and then homicide. For women, the number 1 cause is homicide. 74% of those happen from somebody outside the workplace coming to the workplace. 74%. And who are those people? It's not like that victim is unknown. They're relatives, spouse, family members. And also another factor of that is their past employees that are upset about something. Okay? And, you know, I mention that, but unfortunately we read about those things in the newspaper all the time. So that's the violence. Vulnerable organizations. Organizations that are likely, if they don't get their act together, they may have some problems in this area. They don't have policies, and they don't apply them consistently. Problems aren't addressed. The power is at the top, and by that I mean just one person tries to control everything rather than use their managers to do their job. We've got a tense and stressed workplace. Important issues can't even be discussed. They aren't discussed. That's where you have your silence. They don't talk about important issues. I say again that those important issues, the key critical thing to success of any organization is that you can have those crucial conversations and address problems when they arise, and do it professionally and adult-like. People that can do that, and it doesn't have to be, it can be co-workers, it doesn't have to be top to bottom, it can be at any level. The ability to get from point A to point B through a discussion where people feel comfortable speaking their mind, and mutual respect is maintained through that process. Get to the point where inadequate work is even covered up. How do you minimize it? Talk a lot about predict and prevent legitimate reasons for anger. Sometimes an organization has things that they do that there's no sense to it. Why are we doing it this way? You need to look at those. And maybe those things need to be changed. I tell managers, either those things need to be changed, or if they have to be that way, then tell your people they have to be that way because of this, this, and this. That's part of your communication, effective communication, that you let people know why. And if you see that there's kind of an air of disgruntlement or people are upset about whatever it is, find out, look into it, try to problem solve it, try to openly address it. That's the first one. Confronting problems early. Again, identifying and addressing legitimate sources. Effective communication. The management decisions make sense. You may not agree with them, but making sense means they have explained the why they're doing it that way. You have clear policies that deal with that. You have a policy, in a phrase, someone mentioned it this morning, that talks about the expectation of treating how you treat each other. And I'm not sure, she wasn't able to verbalize and word it exactly what it said, but it came kind of close to some type of civility expectation. And I think it's very important to have something like that. Oh, hey, by the way, it is kind of important that you get along with others, especially if you're 24 hours together for 2 days, or is it 2 days on and then a day off? What's the rotation?
1 day on.
1 day, okay.
Sometimes
24. Sometimes 2. Yeah, it was explained to me. But yeah, even when you have that situation, it's not 8 hours and adios. You're there. So you deal with that. You have training. And boy, the pre-hiring checks is important as well. Before you even let somebody through the door. Why is everybody looking at him?
We had a case where a guy was, management was told not to hire a certain individual, and took 5 years before we had to fire him.
Yeah.
Or ask him to.
Yes, and that 5 years was not a fun 5 years.
Yeah.
You know, I do hiring smart. I do a training in that, and I tell managers, you know, probably the most important decision you make is asking someone, hiring someone. Because you either get a great person that contributes a lot, or a so-so person, or unfortunately someone that for a long period of time, and that can be extremely long, creates a thorn, a problem. All right, let's wrap it up here. There is a disease called anger control deficiency, but it's very rare. Most of the time, people can control their anger. They just choose not to. Okay? It gets them something. So they work through either offering or modeling type behavior. We don't have control over how people act towards us all the time, but we do have control over how we respond to that. Thinking about, reflecting on what I talked about earlier as far as this is what happened, this is how I responded, you could certainly apply that to the emotion of anger. If you set a goal like someone mentioned, you know, I get mad. I don't handle those situations. And I said, well, that's, first of all, it was great that she could admit it, right? I handle some of those situations. Some I do fine, but others I refer to the emotional wheelbarrow tips over. And I said, well, you just have something. You're already halfway there, just in admission that this is something that I could work on. And all behavior is learned. So guess what? You can do that through that process. You can improve that. And I think she's going to make an attempt to do it. So the final thing. The good, bad, the ugly. trying to deal with it that way. And then the resources, and I want to just point to one. The second to last is the one that I've used the most in all these resources. But you have the book Man Search for Meaning and different articles and books there. But the Anger at Work is one that a lot of this information comes from that. So, all right. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You bet. Appreciate it. And we'll see you down the road, maybe.
All right.
Hey, there weren't any alarms. Any more alarms? That's
Great.
great. Yeah. See you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Anything else, if anything?
You know, I don't, but thank you very much. Yeah, I'm sort of used to this routine. It's happening.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
It looks like this thing's still running.
You know, it is going to run,
Okay.
but he said he could turn it off remotely.
Oh,
That's what he's
perfect. Missed it.
And now we need.
That means we should do a